This is Reverse Reset Restore, the podcast that looks to change the way we think, feel, and respond to ourselves and the world around us. I'm your host, Sally, and I'm working on being much more hands-on in my life. Change comes from within. Our thinking, feelings, and experiences are kind of like a game of snakes and ladders, or chutes and ladders, depending on where you are from in the world. Sometimes you make it up the ladder, and then the distorted thinking patterns act like chutes or slides or snakes, and back down you go. When we played this game as children, we didn't just give up the game the first time we landed on a snake or a chute and had to slide down several boxes or rows. We kept going because we know eventually we're going to roll the dice and get all the way up the ladders again. Rolling the dice is, in this analogy, our conscious decisions. The ladders are the positive steps, the changes we make in the way we think, feel, and behave. Sometimes it feels like we are landing only on snakes and slipping back a whole bunch of steps. That's the game. Roll forward with our conscious choices, make some changes, combat the distorted patterns that have become habits, and roll the dice again. In our last episode, Why Your One-Track Mind Always Seems to Run Away From You, we discussed cognitive distortions, including their discovery and how they play into our lives. In this week's episode, we're going to delve deeper into the 10 common types of negative self-talk discussed last week. I'll give you some ideas of removing them, or at least reducing their impact in your life. At the end of last week's episode, I suggested that you might want to spend the next week paying close attention to your automatic thoughts. If you've been doing that, I'd be interested if you've picked up on any patterns or noticed a loop in language or theme. In today's episode, if you notice that any of the cognitive distortions mentioned here seem to be something you're in the habit of automatically doing, just take a moment to write it down. Remember, the objective here is not to judge yourself if you recognize you've been thinking this way. We can't change things if we're not aware of them or how to make those changes. And these patterns are automatic, meaning that you're not consciously choosing to defer to this way of thinking. It's simply the way you have come to look at your life, yourself, and the future. Think of them as your default settings, your autopilot habits, your one-track mind. To refresh your memory, the 10 most common cognitive distortions we're going to look at today are personalization, catastrophizing, filtering or magnifying, polarizing, which is all or nothing or black and white thinking, overgeneralization, emotional reasoning, should statements, labeling and mislabeling, disqualifying the positive, and jumping to conclusions or mind reading. We'll go through each one, what it is, and how you can shift your mind away from its automation and thinking negatively. Number 1, personalization is the ultimate, it's not you, it's me blame game, where you believe that you are at fault whenever a bad situation occurs. If something has gone wrong, you automatically assume responsibility for the circumstances, even if you've had little or no control over the situation. If you take on the belief that anything that is happening to or around you is always your fault, then it's likely you are living in the personalization framework. How do you stop blaming and shaming yourself for events, especially the ones that are outside of your control? Recognize when you are taking excessive responsibility for events or outcomes that are beyond your control. Focus on what you can influence and let go of what you can't. When we are operating out of a personalization ideology, we automatically assume that there is something wrong with us. This leads to further distorted thinking and a rejection of yourself. You feel unworthy, unlovable, and alone. It's normal to feel these things, but it's when it becomes our habitual answer for every situation is where the danger lies. Example: If a friend cancels plans with you, try not to immediately assume it's because they don't like you. Consider that they may have legitimate reasons or other commitments. Reinforce new thinking by having an affirmation, a mantra, or an encouraging thought to replace the personalization ones. So in the above example, when your friend cancels plans instead of thinking they don't like you, you will want to replace it with something that shifts that idea away. Something as simple but as hard to say as I am loved, or I am enough, or their cancellation doesn't reflect on me. Just a side note though, before we move to the next negative thinking pattern, is that this type of thinking can also lead to a victim mentality, which for some people is the habit they've fallen into because it's oddly rewarding. Sometimes we get addicted to playing the woe is me card. Are there people in your life that are like that? Are you like that? Maybe it's time to look at why, providing you're not a narcissist, to why you have a need to feel pitied. Number 2, catastrophizing. Ever heard the story of Chicken Little? The little chicken that, while out in a walk in the forest one day, has an acorn drop on its head. Instead of thinking about what might have landed on his head, Chicken Little decides it's actually the sky falling. Forming this false belief, Chicken Little eventually alarms a whole bunch of other animals, telling them, the sky is falling, the sky is falling. In the original tale, Chicken Little and all the other animals that believe this incorrect conclusion meet an untimely end with a fox, who takes advantage of their catastrophizing what was originally a pretty harmless event. Blowing negative events out of proportion while minimizing positive events is the name of the game for the person who catastrophizes. Just like Chicken Little, you jump to the worst case scenario and assume the worst possible outcome. You see this with people who are overprotective with their children. Every single thing their child might play with will, to the catastrophizing mindset, result in harm. Every benign illness, ache, or pain to the catastrophizing mind means death. It is a pretty exhausting way to live. Living in fear, assuming the worst, waiting for the sky to fall. How do you stop this pattern from being your go-to worse than the worst case scenario? There are a number of ways to recognize when you're engaging in this cognitive distortion and actively work to shift your perspective. Challenge catastrophic thoughts by considering more realistic and balanced possibilities. Look for evidence to support or refute the severity of your concerns. Question your assumptions. Ask yourself, is there concrete evidence to support your worst case scenario? Are you jumping to conclusions without sufficient information? Number 3, filtering or magnifying. This is where you focus solely on the negative aspects of a situation while ignoring any positive aspects or evidence to the contrary. A perfect example of this is when someone may discount all the compliments they receive and only remember the one criticism they got. It's the classic, you only hear what you want to hear. The reality is that we can't always trust ourselves to remember or hear correctly, because our minds have an uncanny ability to extrapolate the negative content and put it under a big old microscope for further analysis. So what can we do about this? Practice recognizing when you are focusing only on the negative aspects of a situation. Challenge yourself to identify positive aspects or alternative perspectives. Example, if you received feedback on a project with both positive and negative comments, instead of dwelling only on the negative ones, try to evaluate the constructive feedback and appreciate the positive aspects. Number 4, polarizing or all or nothing. The person who is an engaged all or nothing thinker, aka polarizing thoughts, see things in black and white terms without any middle ground. It's either perfect or a failure with no room for nuances. This type of cognitive distortion is very judgmental, very critical, and very self-destructive. It's the perfectionist's companion, and it's pretty brutal to your sense of self-worth. You'll never be good enough as long as this is one of your default thinking patterns. Everything that is done or said to you that even remotely appears to be critical allows the polarizing thinker to believe they are a complete failure. So how does one change their black and white, all or nothing polarizing thinking? Challenge the tendency to view situations as either completely good or completely bad. Look for shades of grey and consider multiple perspectives. Commit yourself to focusing on what you did well and reduce the time you agonize over what could be improved. Yes, you may have identified areas for improvement, but if you are an all or nothing, perfect or failure type thinker, it's important to shift your focus away from your perceived imperfections. Example: you have a review at work and your boss compliments you on a number of objectives met and suggests a couple of areas for improvement. Don't label it as a complete failure. Identify those areas for improvement and make a plan to improve. Then write up the compliments or all the things you did well and put it somewhere where you can remind yourself of those achievements, compliments, or positive feedback. I created a wins email folder where I put positive feedback and emails into so that if I get caught up in my all or nothing thinking and feeling like a failure, it serves as positive reinforcement of all the good things I do and the difference I routinely make. Number 5, overgeneralization is the thinking practice where you make broad conclusions based on limited evidence or a single negative experience. For example, if one thing goes wrong, you then assume that everything will always go wrong. Ever caught yourself saying, everything always goes wrong for me, or nothing ever goes right for me, or this always happens to me? Especially when it's the first time you've even tried something new? Yeah, overgeneralization is the Murphy's Law of cognitive distortion. Murphy's Law is the adage that typically states, anything that can go wrong will go wrong. Sometimes it's extended to anything that can go wrong will go wrong, and at the worst possible time. Overgeneralization can quickly become a habit that extends beyond a one-time experience. To break its cycle, be aware of making these sweeping generalizations, especially based on limited experiences. Seek evidence to support or refute your assumptions. For instance, if you made a mistake at work, remind yourself that it doesn't mean you're incompetent or that you always make mistakes. Look for evidence of successful projects you have completed. Remind yourself of where you get it right instead of focusing on what you may have done wrong. Number 6, emotional reasoning is the cognitive distortion where you erroneously believe your feelings equal facts. Feelings are separate to thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors, although it certainly is true that all of them are closely associated with each other. But believing that your feelings dictate reality or assuming that because you feel a certain way it must be true creates barriers between you and other people. This is an isolating tactic of this type of disordered thinking. For example, if someone feels unattractive, they may assume that they are unattractive to everyone else as well, without any supporting evidence. I know we've all looked in the mirror and not liked what was looking back at us. That's a normal thought and feeling to have as a human being at some point or another. What is not normal is to entertain the idea that your feelings are shared and believed by everyone. Emotional reasoning is, in my opinion, a blackmailer, a thief of our thoughts and emotions, robbing us of peace and joy as it forces us to withdraw, avoid, and separate from other people. So, how do you break emotional reasoning off your life? It can be a difficult one to identify because it's steeped in the idea that all feelings are believable. Our feelings may be our feelings, but it doesn't actually make them the best judge of character, a situation or event being the character. This doesn't mean we shouldn't pay attention to our feelings or our emotions. It's just that we shouldn't believe our feelings alone. It's always helpful to base your conclusions about a situation on both your feelings, your emotional response, alongside other sources of information. So if you have a thought like, I feel anxious, so I must be in danger, try saying, just because you feel it, it doesn't mean it's true whenever you recognize you're engaged in emotional reasoning. Or use cognitive restructuring by monitoring your thoughts and asking questions like, if you were to take off your emotional reasoning glasses right now, would you see the situation differently? How would you look at yourself or the situation if you were feeling calmer or more hopeful? What evidence supports or doesn't support the judgments I'm making right now based solely on the feelings I'm feeling? Number 7, should statements. I remember one of my therapists telling me that I was using the word should an awful lot in one of our sessions. She challenged me to stop using it, as the word should leads to a pretty constrictive way of looking at the world, and it is a quite judgmental, weighty word. Just like its counterparts must or ought to, using should statements impose unrealistic and rigid standards on yourself or others. Setting such rigid rules can leave you feeling distressed when those rules are not followed, or lead to feelings of guilt and frustration. For example, someone may believe they should always achieve perfection, and if they fall short, they feel inadequate. Should is a word that puts you in a corner, and nobody puts baby in the corner. It's a shame-based statement implying that you aren't enough. You're not doing enough, you aren't good enough, you will never be enough. Should creates stress and anxiety both in your body and your mind, leading to dis-ease and continued feelings of inadequacies. So, how do we say bon voyage to the shoulds, shouldn't, ought tos, and musts in our lives? Replacing words can help. Should can be replaced with the word could. Should is a judgment. Could is a choice. Or you can look at how you see these situations or circumstances as opportunities for how they benefit our lives, instead of feeling forced where we will either comply or rebel. So, for example, I should eat better can be replaced with, I feel so much better when I make different food choices. See how the should statement feels harsh and rigid and judgy? I should eat better implies that if you don't eat better, you're a loser. If you don't eat better, then you deserve what's coming to you. Whereas the second sentence, I feel so much better when I make different food choices, reflects a much more positive and affirming way to approach changing your eating habits. Focus on the benefits of the choices you're making rather than the constraints or judgments you might feel with the words should or shouldn't. Number 8, labeling and mislabeling. This is the art of attaching negative labels to yourself or others based on past mistakes rather than recognizing the complexity of a person or situation. It's linked to overgeneralization, as it's similar in practice in that it focuses on one past behavior or situation. In assigning labels, you assign judgment. Your colleague is lazy because they leave work right on time every day and you always stay longer. You're dumb because you had to reread some instructions 3 times. The waitress is stupid because they forgot to bring your table water. These types of labels or mislabels are not only hurtful, but they can be very damaging to your own self-esteem and your view, and subsequently your relationships with other people. Look at the judgments that people make on social media sites like Reddit and Quora, etc. And you can quickly identify when labeling or mislabeling cognitive thinking is in action. So, how do we get out of this judgy way of thought? We can try using the ICE technique. Identify, call, explore. So we identify the thought that contains the label, call it for what it is, a cognitive distortion or labeling or mislabeling, and explore if your use of labeling or mislabeling is accurate. Perhaps at the time it felt accurate, but is it still accurate now? So for the example of the waitress forgetting to bring you table water, is it really appropriate to call her stupid? Think about the circumstances. If there were 30 other tables and only one waitress, it's actually pretty reasonable to be understanding of how busy and stressed she was trying to meet all of these various needs. Does the label really fit? Probably not. And are you dumb because you had to read something 3 times to get it? If it was an instruction manual on mechanics and you don't know a screwdriver from a crescent wrench, then no, you've mislabeled yourself. You are not dumb. You're just learning. Number 9, disqualifying the positive. This thinking style is one where you ignore, dismiss, discount, or minimize your positive attributes and experiences. Ever received a compliment and started off your sentence with a yes, but, or you'll minimize a personal achievement with something like, anyone could have done it. Why? Maybe you truly don't believe you're worthy of any praise or compliments. Maybe you feel uncomfortable being noticed. Maybe your previous life experience, background, or personality and attributes have left you feeling like you are not entitled to have positive experiences. Maybe you just refuse to see that good things are happening to you because you are you. I just lucked out. There are also some benefits to disqualifying the positive, which may be enough of a reason driving this cognitive distortion. You get to safeguard yourself from other people's jealousy. You reduce the expectations placed on you from other people. You elicit more compliments and support, and you can show how meek and modest you are because accepting a compliment may have the other person think you believe you're better than them. Where I come from, we call that the tall poppy syndrome. God forbid you take a compliment at face value or that you even bolster yourself without turning it into a disqualifying positive. How dare you think you are good or great or amazing at anything? Well, now we have to cut you down to size so that you remember your place. This concept will be completely foreign to my American friends. For all the mess that America is in, this is one thing I really do value about them. They are big believers in proclaiming your value without having to apologize for it. Us Kiwis, Aussies, and Brits probably could learn to dial back the tall poppy syndrome. David Burns, adjunct clinical professor emeritus of psychiatry and behavioral sciences at the Stanford University School of Medicine, and author of several books including Feeling Great, describes disqualifying the positive as one of the most spectacular mental illusions. You don't just ignore positive experiences, you cleverly and swiftly turn them into their nightmarish opposite. I call this reverse alchemy. The medieval alchemist dreamed of finding some method for transmuting the baser metals into gold. If you have been depressed, you may have developed the talent for doing the exact opposite. You can instantly transform golden joy into emotional lead. So what are the ways you can embrace the awesome of who you are without feeling like you have to downplay it or reduce it to a yes but? Learn to recognize when you are downplaying the good. Keeping a journal or making notes can help you identify when, how often, and if there are particular circumstances that you struggle to accept a compliment or a positive situation in your life. If you catch yourself in the moment of a disqualifying the positive thought, step back and look at the bigger picture. Instead of falling back into that old yes but habit, look for more positives instead. For example, you catch yourself saying, being open isn't a strength when someone thanks you for being courageously honest about a personal circumstance. Instead, think of how you being courageously open is a gift to other people. Your openness gives others permission to do the same. Your honesty could make others in similar situations feel less alone. Your bravery to share may raise awareness for other people who haven't been in your situation, but have now gained some empathy because of you. And number 10, jumping to conclusions or mind reading. This is where you are making negative assumptions without sufficient evidence. This can manifest as mind reading, believing you know what others are thinking, or fortune telling, predicting negative outcomes without a reason. This practice is generally not helpful. It leaves a lot of room for assumptions. And you know what they say about assumptions? It makes an ass out of you, me, and umptions. Jumping to conclusions is a mental exercise that will lead you down many pathways. You'll meander down roads only your imagination can traverse. We see people speculating all the time. Even the media does it, stirring the pot of what might have happened or who could be involved. I've been guilty of jumping to conclusions or trying to decipher the thoughts and motivations of others like a modern-day diviner. Sometimes I'm right, but often my negativity bias has kicked in and set off my I'm not enough-o-meter ringing. So, what should one do if they've fallen into the habit of mind reading? Avoid assuming you know what others are thinking or you know their intentions. Ask for clarification or communicate openly to reduce misunderstandings. Oh, I know, communicate openly. That's a bit of a scary place, isn't it? But it's a thing that we need to do to avoid our fortune telling, our mind reading, or our jumping to conclusions. Example, your best friend suddenly seems distant, and now you automatically assume that they must hate you, that you've done something wrong to make them behave that way. Brene Brown uses the story I'm telling myself is with her husband and family, and it's something we use in our house. Instead of making assumptions that I think I know what the other person is thinking or feeling or meaning, we'll say, the story I'm telling myself is, and then say what we're thinking and feeling. By acknowledging your cognitive distortion in this way, you allow room for expressing your fear-based thoughts and feelings to be explored and release those assumptions by sharing them. You can also choose to be more direct and ask if something is wrong or express your concern for their well-being. This places the opportunity for that person to share what is going on or not, because sometimes people aren't going to give anything away. If that's the case, resist the urge to assume that it is you. Don't jump to conclusions or slip into catastrophizing or another cognitive distorted pattern. There you have it. 10 common cognitive distortions that might be running your default programming and causing you pain. Will this change in thinking miraculously happen overnight or the first time you change the narrative? This takes time to rewire your thinking. It's going to want to go back to the default settings because even though they are negative and painful, they're also familiar. That is what a habit is. It's something familiar. And you can change a habit no matter how ingrained it may seem or how long you've been doing it. It's about being consciously aware of the stories you tell yourself, becoming in tune with listening to that small or raging voice in your thoughts and no longer engaging with it. It requires effort to change out these old habits and replace them with ones that better serve you. You have all the time in the world to do this work. Baby steps, tumble rolls, giant leaps, and snakes and ladders. Thanks for joining me today. I'd love to know if any of these cognitive distortions are familiar to you. I know I've recognized a few of them in my own thinking. If you've been enjoying this podcast, please let me know by hitting that like and subscribe button. I end today's episode, well, really a quote for the last two, as we've been looking at our cognitive distorted thoughts, and I think it's one that we can really pay attention to. Mr. Johnny Cash said, "Close the door on the past. You don't try to forget the mistakes, but you don't dwell on it. Don't let it have any of your energy, or any of your time, or any of your space." As you finish up these episodes, let this quote stay with you. Close the door on those automatic thoughts and their destructive, sabotaging ways. Don't allow them to take anything, any more of you. Take this knowledge and use it to your advantage. You're worth it.